Some people kill to escape the law. Others kill the ones who swore to uphold it. These 5 men didn't run from flashing lights. They chased them. They hunted badges, stalked precinct routines, and memorized shift rotations. Every victim was in uniform. Every reason was personal. These weren't mindless attacks. These were slow-burning revenge stories that exploded in the dark. Because each of these killers believed something had been taken: a brother, a father, a future, a truth. And they decided to take it back the only way they knew how: slowly, quietly, brutally. Between 1994 and 2019, they targeted officers not in shootouts, but in backyards, locker rooms, driveways, squad cars. Some were caught, some vanished. But all of them left a message in blood that even the shield can crack under a patient enough hand. Before we dive into these killer stories, tell us what time you're watching this and where. And don't forget to subscribe, because these killers didn't hide in alleys. They hid in the silence between sirens. Railan Burch didn't grow up hating police. He grew up worshiping one. His older brother, Marcus, was a patrol officer in New Orleans, a man Railan described as a streetlight with a badge, always watching, always glowing, never blinking. Their mother died when they were teens, and Marcus took custody of Railan, raising him between patrol shifts, balancing paperwork with bedtime stories. Railan wanted to be just like him. He studied his case notes, learned 10 codes before algebra, practiced saluting in the mirror. But everything changed in 2001 when Marcus responded to a noise complaint in the Lower Garden district. He never came home. The official report said Marcus entered a row house where a known drug dealer, Jamal "Jig" Farris, was squatting. There was a scuffle, and Marcus was shot twice. But the autopsy didn't make sense. The bullets entered from the back. No powder burns, no signs of struggle. Railan was 16, and something snapped. He spent the next 10 years turning his grief into obsession. He built a spreadsheet of every officer who had been at the scene, cross-referenced call logs, transcripts, even radio silence. And in 2012, when he was 27 and working as a civilian custodian at the same precinct that trained his brother, he began killing them, one by one. The first was Detective Harold Keener, found dead in his home garage. The official cause was suicide, a single gunshot wound to the chest. But the angle was wrong, the entry wound too clean. 2 weeks later, Officer Colton Mears was found dead in his apartment bathtub, wrists slit but no hesitation marks, and oddly, no blood spatter on the walls. The deaths were brushed off as stress-related. The precinct was under pressure. Railan watched from the janitor's closet. The killings weren't random, they were in order. Every officer who had been on Marcus's radio that night. Every man who had failed to intervene when Marcus entered that house. Railan never used the same weapon twice. He used a revolver once, a belt another time. He was surgical, and above all, he left nothing behind. No prints, no DNA, no fiber. He studied evidence handling better than the CSI team. He once buried a used shell casing inside the wall insulation of a public housing complex already scheduled for demolition. Another time, he drowned his gloves in a vat of industrial bleach at a car wash, paying in cash. But what made Railan terrifying wasn't just his precision, it was how he watched. He attended every memorial. He hugged widows. He stood behind honor guards with a stone face and misty eyes. At the funeral for Sergeant Darnell Pope, he handed out bottled water to mourners. He was in every photo, just another grieving member of the department's staff. But one analyst finally caught the pattern. Each dead officer had responded to the 2001 call that killed Marcus Burch. Internal Affairs reopened the case, and when they dug deeper, they discovered that Marcus had radioed for backup twice, and both times had been ignored. He had walked into that house alone because someone didn't like how many arrests he was making in one neighborhood. They left him out to dry, and Railan knew. When IA connected the dots and finally reviewed janitor staff records, Railan vanished. His apartment was empty, no fingerprints, no hair. Even the drains had been chemically burned out. But in the middle of the room, left on a bare mattress, was a single cassette tape. It contained the 2001 dispatch call, and Railan's voice layered over it, whispering the name of each officer he'd killed. He was never caught. He hasn't been seen since. And to this day, whenever an officer dies in Orleans Parish under suspicious circumstances, someone checks the roll call from that night in 2001, just in case the echo returns. Railan Burch disappeared like a ghost, but the echoes of his vengeance didn't stop when he left New Orleans. In the weeks following his vanishing, precinct morale collapsed under the weight of paranoia. Officers began requesting transfers, checking under their cars, refusing to work night shifts alone. Some retired early. Others drank themselves into medical leave. Even without killing another soul, Railan had dismantled the very precinct that let his brother die. But the FBI wasn't done. They issued a federal fugitive alert, flagged every custodian license nationwide, and combed through traffic cams along the I-10 corridor. Nothing. No purchases, no digital trace. His last known activity was caught on a convenience store camera in Kenner, Louisiana. A man matching Railan's build bought 2 cans of gasoline and a pack of matches, then vanished. Investigators believed he may have burned his getaway car, or himself, or both. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, is that Railan didn't stop. He just changed zip codes. 6 months after his disappearance, a retired officer in Tallahassee was found dead, strangled in his own workshop, surrounded by photo albums of his time on the force. The case was ruled a burglary gone wrong, but someone had removed only one item from the house: a framed group photo from the 2001 NOPD Training Academy. 1 month later, a former dispatcher was killed in Shreveport, blunt force trauma with no signs of forced entry. And again, one thing missing: a copy of the original Marcus Burch dispatch transcript, which had been framed on her hallway wall as a personal memento. The press never connected it, but internally, a chilling memo was circulated. Burch may be mobile. Assume relocation. Review all former personnel from 2001 incident. But by then, Railan was already gone again. What made Railan Burch's story even more disturbing was the revelation that came 2 years later, when a home inspector in Macon, Georgia, found a sealed crawl space during a routine estate sale. Inside were 3 items: a janitor's jumpsuit, an empty cassette tape labeled "Marcus, clean copy," and a wall pinned with photos of 24 officers, most crossed out. 8 weren't. They were still alive. And suddenly, local departments across 5 states began re-examining their unsolved police-related deaths. Railan's ability to impersonate staff had improved. He'd once posed as an HVAC repairman to gain access to a retired sergeant's home, then suffocated him using a modified medical mask connected to a shop vacuum. Another time, he entered a retirement banquet disguised as catering staff, laced the honored officer's glass of whiskey with a microdose of an industrial paralytic, then smothered him once he was unconscious in a parking lot. No witnesses, no noise, no struggle. Railan had become something more than a vigilante. He was methodical like a surgeon, patient like a monk, and cold like the city that forgot his brother. When authorities finally declared him legally dead in 2021 due to lack of evidence of life, the case files were sealed. But even then, officers who had once known Marcus Burch began locking their windows again. Some moved across the country. Some stopped speaking to media, because no one truly believed Railan was gone, not with 8 names left, not with that voice, whispering across a tape, reminding them that silence doesn't mean safety. Today, Railan Burch has become a myth in law enforcement circles. Some call him a ghost, others call him justice, but everyone agrees on one thing: If you had a hand in Marcus Burch's death, the echo is still coming for you. Railan killed for blood ties, a brother left behind by his own. But this next man, he didn't lose a sibling. He lost a future that wore a badge and made sure every officer after paid for it. Declan Ror never expected to outlive his son. He was a factory foreman in Grand Rapids, Michigan, blue-collar, widowed, 63 years old. His entire world was his only child, Aiden Rourke, a 22-year-old cadet with the Michigan State Police. Aiden was obsessed with law enforcement the way some kids are with superheroes. He trained early, never broke rules, and never missed curfew. Declan used to say, "He walks straighter than God allows." But in 2014, Aiden died during a routine traffic stop. The reports were vague: a confrontation with a drug runner, suspect resisted, backup arrived late. But the details never settled. The dashcam footage was corrupted. Dispatch logs had missing timestamps. The officer who was supposed to be his backup, Corporal James Lattimore, was off-site at a diner, never disciplined. Declan asked questions, got no answers. And at Aiden's funeral, when he watched that same officer pin a folded flag to his dead son's chest with hands that shook from hangover, something inside Declan broke so quietly it didn't even make a sound. Over the next year, Declan fell apart in private, sold the house, quit the factory, disappeared. Most thought grief swallowed him. But in truth, Declan was sharpening a purpose. He began driving cross-state, watching precincts, logging comings and goings. He rented storage units in 3 counties, bought a second-hand Crown Victoria, repainted it, modified it. He even stitched his own uniform replica using online surplus and memory. By 2016, he looked like a patrol officer, clean, standard, invisible. And that's when he started pulling over cops. He targeted low-level officers first, ones that would respond alone to rural calls. He rigged 911 calls in areas with weak camera coverage, then waited with lights off until the squad car pulled up. His first victim was Deputy Alan Creedy, 31, found dead in his car outside a shuttered diner in Kalamazoo. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, but his lips were blue, pupils dilated, and toxicology revealed trace levels of synthetic fentanyl, the kind used in veterinary anesthesia. Declan had slipped it into a coffee cup placed visibly on a table inside the closed diner with a note, "For the first responder, God bless." It looked like a thank you gift. It was poison. 2 weeks later, Officer Mira Stanton went missing during a solo stop on a rural road outside Muskegon. Her dashcam caught her approaching a vehicle that looked official, then static. Her body was found 48 hours later in a creek, zip-tied, mouth-sealed, cause of death, suffocation via tape gag. Declan left her badge on a rock nearby, perfectly upright. He wasn't just killing, he was making statements. In less than a year, 5 officers were dead. All had tangential connections to the department that failed Aiden. But the final name on Declan's list was Lattimore, the backup who never showed. For him, Declan staged something more elaborate. He left a false warrant notice on Lattimore's windshield, with a callback number leading to a burner phone. Lattimore called. Declan, impersonating a federal agent, requested he come to a nearby impound lot for evidence retrieval. When Lattimore arrived, the gates were open, the cameras looped, and no one else was there. Inside the lot, he found his own son's photo. Then Declan stepped out of the shadows, wearing Aiden's cadet uniform. Lattimore's body was never found. Only his squad car submerged in a quarry with a note stapled to the front seat. Now you know what it feels like to wait. After the disappearance of Corporal James Lattimore, Declan Ror ceased all movement. The murders stopped. The false calls, the staged warrants, the poisoned offerings, all of it vanished with him. For months, departments across Michigan operated under silent panic. Officers no longer responded to solo calls. Dispatch protocols were rewritten. Unmarked vehicles were flagged and re-verified before stops. The funeral for Lattimore was held without a body, without closure, and for all their resources, investigators still had nothing to show but speculation. No DNA, no camera trace, no financial trail. Rourke didn't exist on paper anymore. The house he sold was cash only, his bank accounts long closed, and he'd surrendered his license months earlier. He had become what most killers only fantasize about, a man whose grief made him invisible. But what terrified law enforcement wasn't just his ability to vanish, it was how surgically tailored his kills were. Each victim fit into a jigsaw puzzle connected to his son. He never killed outside that circle. He never lashed out. There was no rage in his work. It was discipline, as though he believed justice itself had a blueprint. One agent later described his methods as almost sacred in their patience, and that scared them more than blood ever could. When the FBI finally located one of his storage units outside Traverse City, it was stripped clean. But a single photo remained. A framed image of Aiden in uniform standing next to a manila envelope filled with newspaper clippings of the murders. On the back of the frame, scrawled in red ink, were 4 words: "We finish what they start." The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized Declan had never intended to escape. He hadn't run, he'd completed a ritual. One by one, he erased the names connected to his son's death, not as vengeance, but as mourning. But despite dozens of interviews, retired precinct visits, and backdoor inquiries into impound records, his final movements were lost to time. Some speculated he died in the woods, left his body somewhere off the grid like an offering. Others believed he took on a new identity and now lives in the shadows, a ghost among civilians, waiting for another name to fail justice. But what truly haunted officers was how easy it had been for him to become one of them. He had blended in perfectly: the uniform, the car, the cadence of his voice. A few victims had even saluted him. The idea that someone could walk in and mimic the authority of the badge so convincingly shattered the illusion of safety many officers held. Departments installed new badge verification systems. Rookie training manuals included new procedures on spotting impersonators. Aiden's name was quietly added to a national training center for cadets, an unspoken admission of guilt from the system that failed him. But Declan Ror's legend didn't fade. To this day, on certain forums and message boards for law enforcement, officers still warn rookies about phantom stops, encounters with unregistered units flashing blue lights on quiet roads. And every time a squad car disappears from radar in Michigan, there's a moment of silence, not just for the missing officer, but for the father who swore he'd make them feel the waiting. Because some killers don't need to leave a body to be remembered. Some just leave a hole so exact, so deliberate, it reshapes the system itself. That was Declan Ror, and he left the justice system forever checking its rearview mirror. Declan made the system flinch because he killed to avenge a future that died too young. But the next man, he wasn't hunting redemption. He was hunting apologies from men who wore the same badge that destroyed his mother. Elias Booker was born in the backseat of a police cruiser on the south side of Cleveland, Ohio. His mother, Marlene, was a drug addict with a rap sheet longer than most case files, and his father's name never made it onto the birth certificate. From the very beginning, Elias only knew 2 things: neglect and uniforms. He grew up under flickering fluorescent lights in state housing, where officers treated his building like a shooting gallery and his mother like disposable clutter. But what cemented his hatred wasn't the beatings or the forced evictions. It was the night officers came for Marlene when he was 11. She had cleaned herself up for 3 months, enrolled in rehab, even started making Elias breakfast again. One night, 2 cops came knocking with a search warrant for an old associate who hadn't lived there in a year. They broke the door, tore apart the apartment, and found a single dime bag in a borrowed coat. Marlene was dragged out in front of Elias barefoot, screaming she was clean. She was back in jail within hours. By morning, Elias was in a foster home. 2 weeks later, she hanged herself in her holding cell. No body cam footage was released. The coroner called it suicide, but Elias never believed it. From that day forward, every cop uniform, every badge, every nightstick became a trigger. He aged out of the system at 16, disappeared from public records by 17, and by 18, he was already building blueprints for his version of justice. He believed in math, not chaos. Every death would add up, every name would be deserved, and the badge would never protect them again. His first victim was Officer Dwight Sanders, one of the 2 men who raided his home that night. Sanders was retired, living alone, and using oxygen support after a battle with COPD. Elias spent weeks observing him, blending in as a neighborhood handyman offering free porch repairs. One morning, he delivered a modified humidifier unit under the guise of a volunteer program for aging veterans. The device was rigged with a slow-release vapor compound, a mix of carbon monoxide and synthetic anesthetic agents. Within 30 minutes, Sanders was unconscious in his recliner. Elias entered through the unlocked back door, unplugged the oxygen line, and simply sat beside him as he died. There were no signs of forced entry, no wounds, no noise. Authorities ruled it accidental due to his pre-existing condition. But Elias wasn't just killing, he was cleansing. Each death had to feel like truth correcting itself. His second target was Officer Paul Kern, the other cop from that raid. Kern was still active, still arrogant, and known for rough tactics. Elias targeted his off-duty hours. He followed him to a private gym, waited until he was alone in the sauna, and slipped in through a side service panel used by maintenance. He had rigged the emergency air system to pump in aerosolized ketamine in bursts. Kern's last moments were a blur of confusion and suffocation. He collapsed inside the steam, and by the time paramedics arrived, his pulse was gone. Another accident, another coincidence. No cameras caught Elias. No fingerprints left behind. He was methodical. Every murder orchestrated with precision. No repeats in method. No traceable pattern. But his third kill shifted things. It wasn't one of the original officers. It was Lieutenant Evelyn Torres, the woman who had signed off on Marlene's post-mortem paperwork. Elias sent her a letter, handwritten. "Do you still believe she jumped?" That same night, her body was found in her garage, carbon monoxide poisoning. But investigators found something odd. Her car was parked in reverse, and the keys weren't in the ignition. The system was starting to catch on, but Elias was already moving on. Elias knew the clock had started ticking the second Evelyn Torres's case raised internal alarms. Her death didn't fit the usual patterns of elderly accidents or natural decline. The gas fumes were too clean, the positioning of her car too perfect, and the note she'd received, though not publicly disclosed, was leaked inside the department. Quietly, homicide detectives began reviewing closed cases of officer deaths. The name Elias Booker never came up. That was by design. He had scrubbed every record of himself from foster logs, health databases, and DMV systems. His identity existed in fragments: borrowed names, temporary housing, burner phones, and stolen social security numbers from the deceased. But Elias had grown bold. With each successful kill, he felt the grip of control. He was no longer powerless in the system that once fed him plastic trays and empty apologies. But that hunger came with carelessness. His fourth target, Sergeant Rick Durnell, was a mistake. Durnell had no connection to his mother's case, no paperwork trail, no direct involvement. Elias had selected him because he'd once testified in favor of Torres during a disciplinary hearing. But Durnell was also smarter than he looked. When Elias posed as a city contractor inspecting fire systems, Durnell asked questions. When Elias returned the next day with tools, Durnell had already alerted the precinct. He played along, let Elias in, then locked the door behind him. What followed wasn't planned. It was messy, desperate, loud. Elias stabbed Durnell in the thigh to drop him, but Durnell fought back, slashing Elias's arm with a box cutter. Blood hit the tile. Footsteps were heard in the hall. Elias fled through a fire escape, leaving behind his fake badge, a partial fingerprint on the counter, and DNA in the form of blood droplets. For the first time, the hunter left a trail. It didn't take long for analysts to match the fingerprint to a death certificate that didn't exist. The alias unraveled. Forensics found connections between Elias's job sites and the homes of the dead officers. A name surfaced. A photo. The face of a boy who'd once been bounced between foster homes, now grown into a man who killed without mercy. But catching him was a different matter. Elias disappeared into the hollow spaces of the Midwest. He had spent years preparing for this phase. Safe houses in abandoned towns, cash stashed inside wall panels, and identities layered deep. He stopped using phones, stopped driving, moved at night through freight depots and industrial back roads. But rage doesn't hibernate. 2 months later, another body turned up. Detective Holly Winslow, a recent academy instructor, poisoned with thallium, the same toxin used in rare lab settings. No direct link to Marlene, but investigators realized Elias had once submitted a false work order to the training facility where Winslow taught. She'd given a guest lecture that referenced the myth of police suicides. Elias had been there, listening, marking her. The FBI declared him a domestic threat. Psychological profilers called him a mission-oriented serial killer with emotional targeting. The media dubbed him the Backdraft Reaper because his kills left no fire, just invisible gas and vanished prints. But despite national alerts, he stayed ahead. His methods were clean, his movements random. In 2022, a cold case review linked 6 more suspicious officer deaths across 3 states to similar poisoning methods. All unsolved, all silent. The last confirmed sighting of Elias Booker was outside a decommissioned juvenile center in Indiana, the same place he'd been processed as a child. Security footage showed him standing across the road, watching the ruins. No movement, no attempt to enter, just staring, then walking away. Authorities believe he's still alive, maybe still hunting. Some say he died in the woods by choice, like a final protest. Others say he's inside the system again, not killing, but whispering into the ears of boys just like him. Boys who lost someone. Boys who were promised the law would protect them. Boys who watched the cuffs go on the wrong people. Because Elias Booker didn't need to be famous. He just needed every officer to remember his name when they sat alone in a quiet room. And he made sure they did, with every breathless, perfect death. Elias was the whisper that haunted badge numbers and death certificates, a ghost born from grief. But this next man wasn't hiding behind shadows. He walked straight through locked gates and smiled at the cameras, because his badge was real, and so were his victims. Officer Landon Maris wasn't a man you feared on sight. That was his power. He didn't wear his cruelty on his sleeve. He stitched it into his smile, hid it in his soft voice, and carried it like an extra sidearm tucked beneath the armor of authority. For 12 years, Maris patrolled the edges of San Bernardino County, working the graveyard shift between overpasses and trailer parks, where complaints died in silence and bodies blended into the dirt. He was well-liked, even respected. He brought hot coffee to dispatchers. He carried groceries for widows. He once pulled a cat out of a drain pipe for a child who later vanished without follow-up. But beneath the surface, Maris was waging a war against the people he once believed were family, police officers. The betrayal began with his own father, Lieutenant Walter Maris, a respected name in Riverside PD, and a man whose rage wore cologne and medals. Landon had grown up with sirens in his ears and bruises on his arms, forced to call the man who beat his mother "sir" in public and "daddy" in reports. At 17, Landon tried to report the abuse. Internal Affairs laughed. "Boys fight with fathers," they said. At 21, Landon graduated top of his academy class, with a smile that masked everything they missed. He didn't join to serve, he joined to study, to learn the routines, the codes, the blind spots. For 10 years he kept a ledger in his mind of every cruel, arrogant, predatory officer he met. The ones who laughed at victims, the ones who pocketed drugs, the ones who smiled too much around handcuffs. And when the day came, Landon chose his first target. Deputy Raul Mendez, a man twice investigated for domestic violence, never charged, always cleared. Landon invited him for beers, like buddies do. Mendez never made it home. His truck was found burned in the Angeles forest, but no body, no blood. Just ashes and a single melted badge embedded in the metal. Landon returned to work the next day with coffee in hand and a smile in place. But Landon didn't kill quickly. He studied patterns. He watched body cams not for training, but for opportunities. He learned which cops silenced radios when no one was looking, which ones met informants off the record. His second target was Sergeant Phil Duvall, known for planting evidence and bragging about it. Landon offered to assist him on a transport run for a parolee who'd violated probation. Duvall agreed. Somewhere between highway exits, Duvall's dashcam went dark. When questioned later, Landon claimed their parolee had escaped into a ravine. Duvall was missing. 2 days later, hikers found a body in pieces along a dry riverbed, scattered, gnawed by coyotes, with only dental records to confirm identity. No charges, no witnesses. Landon filed a statement, attended the funeral, and helped carry the casket. His own body camera had malfunctioned. By the time he reached his third target, Officer Kate Hillard, who'd allegedly falsified testimony in a case that sent a teenage boy to prison, Landon was operating like a surgeon. He began leaving subtle symbols at each scene: a black shoelace tied in a specific knot, an unregistered police radio left on an encrypted channel, and sometimes a coffee lid with a specific smiley face drawn on top, the same way he brought coffee to shift change. Internally, some officers joked about it. Externally, fear began to spread. No one could prove it, but patrolmen stopped riding alone. Supervisors insisted on GPS pings every 10 minutes. But Landon never stopped smiling. His kills grew more confident, and with every staged scene, he left less behind. Hillard's body was found inside her own cruiser, engine off, seat reclined, one bullet hole in her chest, and her service weapon untouched. Her dashcam footage looped the same 30 seconds. The official ruling? Suicide. But Landon wrote the report himself. He made sure it stayed that way, because for him, each kill wasn't revenge. It was an audit, a correction, and no one suspected the smiling man who always brought the donuts to morning debrief. As Landon Maris's quiet vendetta evolved into a campaign of surgical erasure, the department around him began to fracture under pressure. By his fifth kill, whispers had started crawling through the precinct like mold behind drywall. Hushed conversations about coincidences that weren't adding up. Patrol cars found abandoned in odd places, dashcams corrupted without explanation, and bodies surfacing with police-issued zip ties cinched too perfectly for randomness. Still, no one pointed at Landon. He had cultivated the persona of the harmless helper, the guy who always volunteered for night duty, who bought birthday cakes for dispatchers, who once stopped traffic to help a raccoon cross the road. But that facade cracked when he set his sights on Officer Remy Toller. Toller was known in the locker rooms for being loud, reckless, and dangerously insecure, the kind of cop who escalated every traffic stop into a shouting match. But what made him a target wasn't his temper, It was the security footage from a liquor store where Toller shoved a homeless man so hard he fractured his ribs, then laughed when the man vomited in the street. Landon saw it and made a decision, but this time he wanted to send a message. He invited Toller on a routine late-night sweep in an industrial zone. 2-man patrol, low priority. Halfway through, Landon triggered the cruiser's panic button. Dispatch received a single garbled voice clip, then silence. When backup arrived, they found Toller slumped over the dashboard, a clean shot through the side of his neck, artery severed, but no gunpowder residue. Landon was found on the ground, unconscious, bruised, claiming they'd been ambushed. It was the perfect lie, until it wasn't. An EMT at the scene noted something odd. Landon's injuries looked staged, too symmetrical, and one of the bruises was already yellowing, like it was days old. Internal Affairs flagged the incident. Landon's cruiser GPS logs were pulled. One showed an unscheduled detour an hour before the panic button, a brief off-road stop near an abandoned water tower. That location, when searched, revealed gloves, a burner phone, and a police-issued Glock buried in a metal container. Forensics matched the bullet to Toller's neck. The noose tightened. But Maris didn't run. He stayed, showed up to work, smiled, and watched as the walls closed in. When they brought him in for questioning, he didn't flinch, denied everything, offered theories, even blamed cartel retaliation. But behind closed doors, detectives found his locker empty. His service weapon, missing. His laptop wiped. And in the file room, a single report was found inside a manila folder labeled, "To whom it may concern." It listed dates, times, and names, 5 officers, each dead, and a sentence at the bottom in block print, "I didn't kill cops. I removed the disease." The department exploded. Media swarmed. Landon was arrested, suspended, and indicted. But the trial never happened. 1 week before court proceedings, he was found dead in his holding cell, hanged with a shoelace, the same knot found on his previous victims. No note, no final confession, only a coffee lid carefully balanced on the edge of the sink with a crude smiley face drawn in black ink. Official reports ruled it suicide. But some officers, especially those who once rode with him, believed otherwise. Some think someone on the inside ended it for him, to bury the scandal. Others say Maris had a follower, someone who finished the job. Whatever the truth, Officer Landon Maris became a legend inside police corridors, a name spoken in nervous laughs and late-night whispers. A man who wore the same badge he came to despise. A smiling officer who opened doors, carried files, cracked jokes, and quietly, methodically, erased his own kind. Not for thrill, not for fame, but because no one had erased his father. And this was his apology to the child he once was. Maris wore the badge like a loaded question, smiling while the rot bled underneath. But our final killer didn't just want revenge. He wanted every officer to look into his eyes and feel what they made him feel, forgotten, framed, and furious. Jeremiah Cole was the kind of man the world forgets until it's too late. He wasn't born evil. He wasn't even angry, not at first. He was, by all accounts, quiet, capable, and desperately loyal. His father was a railroad worker in Ohio who died of a preventable heart attack because the officer responding to the 911 call didn't arrive in time. He was parked 2 blocks away finishing a cigarette. That officer never faced consequences. In fact, he received a commendation for rapid response. Jeremiah was 11. That night, he learned 2 things. Time lies, and uniforms don't always save you. His mother spiraled into silence and pills. By 15, Jeremiah was stealing food from convenience stores. At 17, he was framed for assault after pushing a cop who'd grabbed his backpack during a stop and frisk. He spent 4 months in juvenile detention for a crime he didn't commit. Inside, he met others, boys just like him. Quiet, discarded, pushed to the edge not by poverty, but by patterns. Authority was never just rules and law, it was faces, names, and fists. He memorized every one. By the time he was released, the man who'd arrested him had been promoted. He'd even shown up at Jeremiah's school once, smiling during a career day. That smile followed Jeremiah through every job rejection, every eviction notice, every traffic stop where he was called son, like it was a threat. But Jeremiah didn't explode. He incubated. At 28, he applied to be a corrections officer, not to change the system, to understand its plumbing, to learn the schedules, the shadows, the supply closets, and the silence between checks. He wasn't there to stop violence. He was there to build something quieter than rage. The first man he killed wasn't just any officer. It was Sergeant Dale Monroe, the same man who pulled that cigarette while Jeremiah's father died on a living room floor. Monroe had retired early, then took a side gig teaching inmate control tactics at a state prison outside Dayton. Jeremiah transferred there under the radar, falsifying parts of his background with a cousin's clean record. He worked nights, cleaned floors, watched routines. When Monroe returned for a guest lecture on compliance under stress, Jeremiah made sure the surveillance system blinked. Monroe never made it to the parking lot. His body was found 3 days later in a crawl space above the administration wing, zip-tied, dehydrated, throat crushed by a boot. The death was ruled accidental at first. Collapsed while attempting maintenance, the report said. But Jeremiah knew the truth. He'd made sure of it, that the final sound Monroe heard was the squeak of the same boots worn by the man he'd ignored 20 years ago. After Monroe, something in Jeremiah clicked into place. Not celebration, not relief, but a terrifying calm. He didn't feel like a murderer. He felt like a janitor who finally mopped up a stain no one else had touched. And once he did it, the silence that followed wasn't guilt. It was purpose. From that moment forward, Jeremiah Cole became an invisible architect of retribution, but his blueprint wasn't just about revenge, it was systemic disassembly. He didn't kill for rage or thrill. He killed like a surgeon removes tumors, one by one with precision, knowing exactly where to cut so the host doesn't scream too loud. He stayed in the prison system, rotating shifts, offering to cover night duty, always seen as the quiet one who just does his job. No one suspected he memorized every officer's habits, the ones who bragged about roughing up inmates in blind spots, the ones who smuggled in favors for gang favors, the ones who laughed when someone bled. Jeremiah kept files, hand-drawn diagrams of guard posts, cleaning schedules, water pressure timings that created pressure drops in surveillance plumbing, all cataloged in a small black ledger duct-taped to the bottom of his locker. His second kill was Officer Will Hansen, a man known for forcing inmates to kneel for practice, and once fractured a man's wrist for not saying, "Yes, sir," fast enough. Jeremiah didn't ambush him. He befriended him. They shared smoke breaks behind the generator shed. Jeremiah learned Hansen's favorite coffee order, how he liked his gloves powdered inside out, how he always took his boots off when napping in the guard dorms. And one night when Hansen dozed off between shifts, Jeremiah placed a plastic bag over his head, cinched with a tightened electrical cable, and applied silent, sustained pressure until the man kicked only once. The body was discovered slumped over the edge of the cot, mouth open, eyes bulging, ruled as cardiac arrest from sleep apnea. Jeremiah even helped carry the body out, stone-faced, sleeves rolled up. His third kill, Lieutenant Bradley Voss, required more complexity. Voss had a history of sexually harassing female staff and offering reduced sentences to inmates in exchange for favors. Jeremiah didn't just want to kill him, he wanted to erase him. Over weeks, he planted fake disciplinary reports into Voss's logbooks, all unsigned, to establish a pattern of erratic behavior. Then, on the night shift, during a staged pipe leak, he lured Voss to the plumbing shaft beneath D-Wing, a dead zone for cameras due to metal interference. He'd already prepared the crawl space, insulation removed, rebar exposed, a single length of sharpened steel rod waiting. When Voss crouched to inspect the leak, Jeremiah drove the rod through the base of his skull, twisting it once. No noise, just a blink, a shudder, and stillness. He left the body positioned as if he'd slipped. Jeremiah filed the maintenance report himself. The prison staff chalked it up to an old drunk too careless to check his footing. But the blood was cleaned, the rod was reshelved, and the ledger at home now had 3 names. Jeremiah began marking the pages with a single small dot beside each. Red for pain-based crimes, black for abuse of power, and blue for those who never apologized. By now, prison staff had started whispering. Too many deaths, too many accidents, all clustered within the same wings, the same shift rotations. But Jeremiah adapted. His 4th and 5th kills weren't just about punishment, they were messages. Officer Dean Lapierre was a lifer, known for shoving inmates' faces into meal trays and once waterboarding a teenager as a joke. Jeremiah didn't go silent this time. He recorded Lapierre bragging on a staff radio frequency about the incident. Then, after swapping a fake maintenance call log, he isolated Lapierre near the fire exit stairwell where the external lock had long been rusted shut. There, he injected the man with potassium chloride, a substance that mimics a heart attack but vanishes quickly in toxicology if the tests aren't ordered precisely. Lapierre fell to the ground, gasped, and died within 60 seconds. When the ambulance arrived, Jeremiah handed them a clipboard with all necessary forms already filled out. Clean, precise, expected. His 5th and most haunting kill came 6 weeks later. Officer Tony Briggs wasn't just cruel, he was beloved. That made him dangerous. Behind the charm was a man who made inmates fight in the laundry room for sport, sometimes betting commissary on who'd bleed first. Jeremiah didn't kill Briggs in secret. He killed him in front of cameras, but made it look like a justified accident. During an inmate scuffle he himself had provoked using whispered threats and tension between 2 cell blocks, Jeremiah intervened, pulling Briggs into the middle of it. When the melee broke out, Jeremiah tried to rescue him, but shoved Briggs in the path of an oncoming broom cart. The impact snapped his spine. Jeremiah screamed into his radio, called for backup, performed CPR. The footage showed him trying everything. Briggs was pronounced dead. Hero officer dies protecting fellow staff. Jeremiah received a citation for bravery, but he didn't frame the moment. He marked it in the ledger with a single blue dot, because Briggs once told a crying inmate, "No one out there cares you're in here." Jeremiah wanted the world to care, not about Briggs, but about the rot inside the walls. And now, it was getting closer to the surface. Jeremiah might have continued for years, a silent grim reaper cloaked in policy and routine, if it weren't for the mistake he never realized he made. It wasn't blood, fingerprints, or surveillance. It was a single pattern, too clean. A junior data analyst named Sophia DeMaio had just joined the Department of Corrections Inspector General's office. Her job was mindless. Check patterns in incident reports. She noticed the first anomaly during her 2nd week. 5 sudden deaths across 2 years, all on B or D wings, all during 3rd shift, and all with no consistent cause. At first, it looked like bad luck. Then she noticed a name, Jeremiah Cole, always on shift, always near. She flagged it to her supervisor, who dismissed it as coincidence and warned her not to stir old dust. But Sophia dug anyway. She cross-referenced Jeremiah's time cards with medical emergency logs, saw how 3 of the 5 deaths occurred within 15 minutes of a brief surveillance outage, how 2 of the supposed accidental deaths had pre-filled reports, submitted before EMTs even confirmed time of death. Then she did something no one else had. She visited the families of the deceased. One inmate, who'd been friendly with an officer named Voss, had written home about a shadow cleaning up the dirty ones 2 weeks before Voss died. A former janitor recalled seeing Jeremiah sitting alone during lunch, scribbling into a black book. Sophia requested his locker be searched. It was empty, sanitized to the point that even the dust looked unnatural. But she noticed the one place no one checked, beneath the bench of the staff locker row. Taped there was the ledger. 112 pages, color-coded, cross-referenced, handwritten case numbers, victim names, officer logs, and cryptic notations like 1212, crying again, denied it, blue, and Briggs bets on blood, he dies smiling. Sophia didn't take it. She photographed every page, then sent it to her private server, and vanished from her office the next day. Gone. No badge swipe, no phone activity. The last surveillance footage showed her entering the basement file room. Then nothing. Jeremiah knew, not because anyone told him, but because the silence changed. Colleagues stopped smiling as quickly. His schedule suddenly shifted without notice. Cameras that were once always broken blinked to life. He tried to stay still, tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the walls had turned. Then came the final trigger. A photo slipped under his door at home. It showed Sophia, gagged, sitting in a chair, eyes wide. No note, no return address, just the message, "We know." Jeremiah disappeared that night. The front door was left ajar, lights on, food still warm on the stove. A duffel bag with $7,000 in small bills was missing, along with a flash drive, a burner phone, and his only pair of hiking boots. A week later, a trail camera in a remote section of Shawnee National Forest captured a grainy image of a man matching his description, walking alone into the woods. He was never seen again, but the deaths didn't stop. In the 3 years following his disappearance, 4 more correctional officers across 3 states died in strange, staged accidents. One was drowned in an unlocked water tank despite no history of depression. One suffocated with a towel stuffed down his throat, but no DNA was found on the fabric. One vanished, and the only clue was a sticky note on his fridge with the words, "Blue Dot." Whether it was Jeremiah or a copycat, no one could confirm. What they did know was that Jeremiah's ledger ended with 21 names, and the last page was blank, except for a sentence written in small, tight letters. Justice never needed permission, just timing. Some called him a monster, others a necessary infection. But the ones who really understood him weren't officers. They were the forgotten sons of forgotten men. The ones who watched their fathers die, their brothers cuffed, their stories twisted. And for them, Jeremiah Cole wasn't a ghost. He was the last man left who remembered. 5 men, 5 quiet wars. They didn't hunt strangers in alleyways or stalk victims in shadows. They walked the same halls, wore the same uniforms, followed the same routines. But behind every patrol, every key ring, every shift change, they carried something else, a slow, surgical kind of rage. Each one believed the system had failed, so they became the correction. And whether they vanished into the woods, got swallowed by their own evidence, or simply faded from a roster sheet, their stories don't end with capture. They end with a question, not who could do something like this, but how many more already are.